Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to start the second panel. I'm going to briefly introduce a man who needs no introduction in Houston and abroad, Charles Foster. It would take me several hours to go over his many accomplishments, but just a few of them. He's the chairman of Foster LLP, one of the largest global immigration firms in the country. He's also honorary consul of the Kingdom of Thailand. He's the chairman of the American Bar Association Coordinating Committee on Immigration Law, of Americans for Immigration Reform, and of the Greater Houston Partnership's Immigration Task Force, which I've had the privilege of participating in that as well with him. He's also served as policy advisor on immigration to Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And going back to Oscar's comment, I guess I'm one of the handful of Costa Ricans who did migrate to the US, and it's thanks to Charles Foster that I got my visa. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Charles Foster and our panelists.
Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here, and like everyone else, I want to thank AJC and Randy and the Baker Institute for providing this incredible forum and for all the arrangements that have been made for you, the attendees, and the panelists. And I want to, in a moment, I will introduce the panelists on, I think, probably in some ways sort of the fun panel to be on, because given the reality that there are many foreign policy implications to this and the importance of working collaboratively internationally, immigration policy ultimately will come down to being a domestic policy issue for each country, and in the U.S. that's particularly true. We all know simply by reading the newspapers every day that this is a hot political issue, often referred to as the third rail of American politics. And while I think most of us in this room would applaud President Obama's executive actions that he announced on November the 20th, we would also recognize that that falls far short in terms of what he actually did. I personally think he could have done more. But it's still, as the president has said repeatedly, there's just so much any president can do through executive actions. And in the end, this is a political decision, and Congress needs to deal with this. And I'm sure we'll spend quite a bit of time about why that has not happened and what the prospects are going forward. As Tony said this morning on the first panel, this is both not only just a Democratic but a Republican issue. I'm sort of nonpartisan, as Erica indicated. I've worked for both Republicans and Democrats, but I wind up speaking a lot more to the Republicans and Republican audiences because, frankly, to some significant extent, that's where the problem is from a political point of view. The Republican, I was about to say the Republican leadership has a hard time dealing with this, but that's probably no longer, not as true as it used to be. It is the Republican caucus, the individual congressmen who look to their own most basic instinct, their own political survival. I talk to individual members of the Republican Party, and there are they fall in two different classes. The true ideologues, that are the true believers that we have to seal the border and we cannot do anything on immigration reform, and that are very negative about it. But the vast majority that I talk to are pretty pragmatic. They understand the issue, not that well, frankly. Very few politicians do. But with one exception, which will surprise you when I mention his name in a few minutes, but they all say the same thing, that they cannot vote for anything that is remotely, that has the word comprehensive or even the word reform, or certainly not anything that's been labeled amnesty, for fear that they're going to meet an opponent, not in the general election, but in the next primary, that someone will run to their right and try to undermine them in saying that they voted for amnesty, no matter what it is. The A word, the scarlet letter word, could sink them in a possible primary. I was about to say the leadership, but one of the things that came out of the 2012 election that surprised me after Governor Romney, in some ways, I was hoping it would be possible to say after that election that Governor Romney lost the election over his sort of hardline stance he took in the primaries on immigration. But in fact, the election victory of President Obama was so broad in terms of the Electoral College that you really could not honestly say that there was 4 toss-up states that arguably, and I'm sure the panel will go into that he lost Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and Florida, at least in part over the immigration issue. But we really can't say that because of the scope of President Obama's victory. But what was encouraging to me, almost shocking, was right after that when I heard Speaker Boehner, who I've gotten to know pretty well, just say, we have to address immigration reform. So we had a heady moment after the 2012 election where we had I think most of you know, a bipartisan, more or less bipartisan coalition in the Senate that ultimately was successful in passing a pretty decent, broad-based, comprehensive immigration reform bill in June of 2013. And of course, as we all know, the House failed to do so. There was lots of fits and starts. There was discussions about passing a series of bills that would have more or less mirrored collectively what the Senate had done. But in the end, Boehner never allowed any votes on any immigration legislation because of the so-called hazard route. He needed a majority of the majority. In other words, arguably, the House overall with enough Democratic votes would have passed that, but he did not allow any of those bills to go forward because there was not enough support within his own caucus. I was hoping at some point that he would sort of go down in the history books and cause that vote to happen, even though it probably would have caused his speakership. He would have fallen on his sword for the greater good, but he decided to live to fight another day, and he was reelected speaker, just reelected speaker. Again, we're going to go into this in great detail, but I think when you talk about, by the way, I want to introduce someone who really plays a significant role in immigration. That's the Consul General of the Republic of Mexico, Luis Malpica. Luis, you want to stand up? Because it's such a big issue for Mexico. I just want to make a few more observations and introduce the panel. This ultimately, in some ways, has been, always probably will be a political issue. We didn't have, if you think about it, we didn't have much of an immigration crisis through the better part of American history because we had we didn't have any permanent quota until 1923. Interestingly, we did not impose a quota in the Western Hemisphere until 1968. And so to some significant degree, Congress, we could say, created this problem because they made, through law, a much more increasingly restrictive system. So to the point that when you hear politicians say that those people should just go back and get in line and come in legally, those of us here on the panel, many of you would know that that's just, there's no truth to that. There is no such thing. The line, of course, would be the quota, but if you look about how the system works, that would be impossible. I've asked every politician, everyone I've met running for president, and most members of Congress, if they actually know what the effective quota is for semi-skilled, low-skilled workers, because let's face it, when in political terms, when the American public thinks of immigration, they think of low-skilled immigrants coming across the southern border, large numbers of undocumented immigration, of immigrants who've overstayed and doing the jobs that most Americans do not want to. So how could they come in? What's the total number of those, for those individuals to come in legally if they had gotten in line to come in? And maybe some of you know, but the annual quota for low-skilled workers on an annual basis is 5,000. And the way that the State Department counts, and although it's not legally required, and our firm, and I'm sure others, I'm still hoping that the President, as he implements his executive actions, will change this policy. They count, instead of counting the individual beneficiary against the quota, they count each family member. So if we have 5,000 visa numbers set aside for low-skilled workers, that's really misleading because that includes their immediate family member, their spouse, and any children. So maybe that's effectively closer to 1,250 a year. So I once calculated that we have more than We have more than 1,000 cities in America with a population of 20,000 or greater. If that's true, and I think that's true, that means one person a year could legally immigrate to Houston to do all the work that no one else wants to do. So it's sort of a joke. The other thing I want to talk about is, speaking of I'll mention 2 or 3 politicians that just shows you how out of step they are. I noticed Michelle Bachmann, she was joined later by Rick Santorum, campaigning, and Michelle Bachmann said something that she wanted an immigration policy just like we used to do it, where we should do it, just like they did it through Ellis Island, if we just could go back to that policy. And then Rick Santorum was unique because he was truly, and he made I think it was a very positive thing, he made a very important statement as he was campaigning. He was the son of an immigrant. I can't remember, maybe some others, when the last time we had someone running for the president that was a son of an immigrant. His father immigrated as a young man from Italy with his grandfather, and the grandfather came to do, I think, work in the coal mines, I'm not certain, something like that, Pennsylvania. And why? He wanted a policy just like that. If everyone could just do it just like his dad, grandfather. So I met with Rick Santorum, and so just one-on-one. So I said, I have to congratulate you, Senator. I said, not only are you setting an example as the son of an immigrant running for president, but you have also called for the most liberal, open-minded policy of any candidate in over a century. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, when your granddad immigrated, there were no quotas at all. Well, you're advocating for the lifting of all quotas, and all we have to do is make sure that all these people in the country, just like they did through Ellis Island, that was a quarantine station, just to make sure they had no contagious disease. I said, that will wipe out illegal immigration overnight. So he said, oh, no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that. Anyway, I could go on and on, but that would be unfair. So I would like to introduce our 2 panelists, Dr. Sylvia Manzano with Latino Decisions, where she develops strategies to engage Latino voters, which is a particular interest here in the state of Texas, of course, and we'll talk about that. I bleed orange, but I'll nevertheless mention that she taught at Texas A&M University, that little school up the road, and she has her political science, PhD degree in political science from the University of Arizona. Our co-panelist, Dr. Mark Rosenblum, who's been here before, he was here last year, has his BA from Columbia University and PhD from the University of California, San Diego. He was among many things that caught my attention, he was a Council on Foreign Relations Fellow, detailed to the office of U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy, who played such an extraordinary role in the immigration policy. Specifically, he sort of marshaled in through the Senate following the death of his brother, the 1965 Act, which was sort of the seminal law that really is the basis of our immigration policy today. And today, Mark is the director of U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. So we're going to start with Mark.
Thank you. So I worked for Senator Kennedy on the 2006 bill, not the 1965 bill, since I was...
I was amazed how you look.
I was -4 then, so... let me also thank the AJC and thank Erica and Tony and the Baker Institute for letting me join you today. It's great to be home in Houston. I grew up about 1.5 miles from here and spent a lot of my middle school years in the game room about 200 yards from here, putting quarters in the Rice game room. So thank you. Good morning. What I want to cover in my comments is a bit of recent history, and I'll go back over some of what Charles talked about on where the immigration debate has been, where we are today, and where we're going, where we may be going. And I want to start, the starting point for any broad conversation about U.S. immigration policy is that the United States is now home to about 11.4 million unauthorized immigrants. And I want to pause for a moment to reflect on that number, because we hear numbers like that, they don't really mean anything to us. But the entire 9-county Houston, Galveston, Woodlands, Sugar Land metro area has about 6 million people. So almost twice that many people, all of them unauthorized. If all 11.4 million unauthorized immigrants lived in the same state, it would be the 8th largest state in the country, just behind Ohio with 11.5 million people, well ahead of Georgia with 10 million. And if they all lived in their own country, unauthorized Landia would be the 75th largest country in the world, bigger than 25 members of the UN. So, that's really a big, that's the scope of that challenge is a lot of what makes immigration policy difficult. And it bears emphasis that we have 11.5 million unauthorized immigrants, despite the fact that the United States spends $18 billion a year on immigration enforcement, more than all other federal law enforcement objectives combined. So how did we end up with so many unauthorized immigrants? As Charles was talking about, the answer is that unauthorized immigration is a function of policy choices that are a bad match to underlying migration push and pull factors. Bad policy choices have been hard to undo for political reasons that I'll talk about, and they've been amplified over time. So most people don't know that prior to the 1970s, the U.S. had fewer than 1 million unauthorized immigrants, well under 1 million unauthorized immigrants, and most of them who were in the country were circular immigrants who went home every year. The roots of mass unauthorized migration are a pair of legislative developments in 1964 and 65 that sort of created the current system and the current problem. In 1964, Congress allowed the U.S.-Mexico Bracero program to expire. This was a guest worker program that had previously brought in 450,000 legal temporary workers a year. And in 1965, Congress rewrote the Immigration and Nationality Act, the basic immigration law, and established new rules for admitting legal permanent immigrants that imposed strict numerical limits for the first time on the Western Hemisphere, on Mexicans and others from the Western Hemisphere. So both those changes were well-intentioned. Senator Kennedy, his heart was in the right place, but they were badly designed. And the most important design flaw was that these changes to shut the door to legal immigration, permanent and temporary migration from Mexico, came at exactly the same time that U.S. and global economic changes caused surging demand for low-skilled workers, and also at the same time that the costs of international travel were falling sharply. So this combination was sort of the perfect conditions for encouraging unauthorized flows. And more generally, the INA describes categorical reasons that people can immigrate to the United States because they have a spouse who has a green card or because an employer wants to hire them. But it combines these categorical rules with strict numerical limits, and the number of people who fall into the categories is a lot larger than those numerical limits. So there's now about 4 million people around the world who have already been approved for a U.S. visa, but they face wait times of 5 to 10 to more than 20 years before their number comes up. And a 20-year wait time is just not realistic for a policy that is designed to promote family reunification. And a 5 or 10-year wait time doesn't make sense for employers who are trying to hire needed workers. So those conditions quickly created, increased unauthorized inflows beginning in the 1970s. And over the next 3 decades, the U.S. policy response has focused almost exclusively on the symptoms of those design flaws rather than the underlying causes. So rather than address the visa system, we've focused on securing the southwest border and making it easier to apprehend and deport unauthorized immigrants. Congress also made it illegal in 1986 to knowingly hire unauthorized workers to limit illegal employment-based immigration, but employer sanctions provisions have been almost impossible to enforce. So the result for most of the 1980s and 90s was a very stable policy regime that relied on not enforcing immigration controls beyond the border. U.S. employers were happy because they were able to hire unauthorized workers. Immigrants were mostly happy because once they got past the border, they could work and be with their families with very little chance of being deported. And politicians were happy because they were able to avoid hard questions about how to fix the visa system as long as they kept throwing more resources at the Border Patrol. This equilibrium really only began to break down in the 1990s as unauthorized immigration continued to increase and began to spread to states farther away from the border. And it really broke down after 9/11 when immigration control came to be seen as a national security issue, and suddenly it became important to produce results. So at the risk of oversimplifying a bit, the post-9/11 period has been characterized by 2 opposing views. One side has argued in favor of tougher immigration enforcement, still tougher enforcement, more resources at the border, more efforts to deport people who get past the border, and overcoming the obstacles to worksite enforcement. The other side sees enforcement only as a failed policy and has argued for a package that is described as comprehensive immigration reform, CIR. The logic of CIR is to make additional refinements to enforcement, but that the only way to prevent unauthorized immigration is to address the underlying supply and demand issues through visa reform. And the most important difference between CIR and the hardline response is the argument that it would be both inhumane and impractical to deport over 11 million people, half of whom have been in the United States for more than 10 years. Instead, CIR says that most of those people should be allowed to earn an opportunity to remain in the United States. So this argument makes a lot of sense. It probably makes a lot of sense to most people in this room. But when you look at the historical record since 9/11, what you see is that hardliners have carried the day. The U.S. has made massive additional investments in enforcement at the border. And for the first time, the United States has also begun deporting huge numbers of unauthorized immigrants from within the United States. Despite support from both President Bush and President Obama and key leaders in both parties, CIR bills have been consistently defeated without reaching the president's desk. So the important question for where we are going is, why has the immigration debate been so heavily tilted in favor of immigration enforcement over CIR? And one answer to this question is the complexity of designing good immigration law, especially given that large number of unauthorized immigrants. So even if we agree on the general goals of comprehensive immigration reform, it's difficult to design a bill that combines all these elements in a coherent way. And I'm not going to talk about that. We can talk about that in Q&A if people want. I want to focus on the harder obstacles, which are political. So I want to mention four sort of core political challenges, four asymmetries in the immigration debate that make it easier to strengthen enforcement than to legalize unauthorized immigrants or to expand immigrant visas. First, there's a political economy challenge. The powerful economic interests that favor enforcement, private prison operators, immigration enforcement bureaucracies, have a more concentrated stake in the status quo than the economic groups who would benefit from reform. Employers would prefer a more rational visa system, but most of them can muddle through pretty well with the status quo. So basic interest group theory that you learn in political science is that advocates for enforcement will lobby harder to protect their interests than advocates for reform. This relates to a second issue about interest groups more generally around immigration. There's a broad coalition of groups that favors comprehensive immigration reform. It includes religious organizations like the AJC, immigrant rights groups, businesses, labor unions, civil libertarians, really across the political spectrum. But each of them cares about a different element of immigration policy. Some care about legalization, more visas for workers, more visas for high-skilled workers versus low-skilled workers versus families, what enforcement should look like, and so on. When it comes to the actual give and take of the legislative process, this group is easy to divide and conquer. On the other side, there's really only one group that favors more enforcement. It's immigration hardliners who oppose amnesty and want less immigration overall. This group is smaller in number, but much more cohesive and more passionate, and they're concentrated in Republican-leaning electoral districts. So House Republicans have strong political incentives to support an enforcement-only approach. Looming demographic change that Sylvia may talk about promises eventually to shift these dynamics, but electoral maps and low Latino voting rates mean that demographic drivers are still several years away from changing those politics. So third sort of political asymmetry is a rhetorical asymmetry. I've explained the structural roots of unauthorized immigration, how the system is badly designed, but this is a complicated argument without good guys and bad guys. There's also a much easier story to tell, which is also true, about 11 million unauthorized immigrants who have violated U.S. immigration law, either by entering illegally or overstaying a visa. My story has no easy solutions, but the hardline story is simple. Unauthorized immigrants are bad, and it has a clear solution. Hold them accountable by deporting them. It's a much easier and more powerful argument to make. And the most important asymmetry is procedural. I've described the current system as a non-enforcement equilibrium. The reason we have lots of unauthorized immigrants is that for years we have failed to enforce immigration control policies on the books. That means hardliners don't need to achieve legislation don't need new legislation to achieve their policy goals. They just want to strictly enforce the laws on the books. But there are no laws on the books that can legalize millions of unauthorized immigrants. And there's no laws on the books that can allow a lot more legal migration and address visa supply and demand problems. Those require legislative change. So this gives a huge negotiating advantage to hardliners because it's much easier in our divided powers bicameral system to block a new law than to pass a new law. So that sets the stage for where we are today. On November 20th last year, President Obama announced a series of executive actions on immigration policy. The president pledged to expand a temporary legalization program for unauthorized youth who arrived as children, the DACA program, and to create a new program for unauthorized parents of U.S. children and permanent residents, the DAPA. Along with other related changes, the announcement affects about half of the country's unauthorized immigrants. About a little over 5 million unauthorized immigrants are going to be eligible for one of those programs. And a second set of announcements that the president made, second set of actions, will modify existing immigration enforcement policies, including who the Department of Homeland Security targets for deportation and how it cooperates with state and local police departments through the Secure Communities program. This part of the announcement has been a bit more under the radar, but it's actually even more far-reaching than DACA and DAPA because if the enforcement reforms are fully implemented, they'll offer a degree of protection to about 3/4 and maybe as many as 80 or 85% of all existing unauthorized immigrants. So it bears emphasis that the executive actions face a series of important challenges to being implemented. Texas is leading a coalition of 27 states which have filed a lawsuit to block the reforms, and that's going to be heard this week, as most of you probably know. And Congress is going to vote today on legislation that would overturn the changes, that would also overturn the changes through legislation. And they could also seek to block DHS funding for them. And probably the most important question, even if the changes survive those challenges, is that implementing DACA and DAPA will depend on user fees. And so they'll require that lots of eligible people sign up in order for USCIS to have the money to keep the programs going. And there are questions about how successfully DHS can implement all of this just logistically. So those are really big questions. But assuming that the executive action survives those challenges and succeeds, it represents a huge shift in the immigration status quo. Executive action does not do a lot to address the underlying root causes, the supply and demand issues. And that's for the reasons I just said, that those challenges are based in legislation and can't be undone by executive action. But the actions that were announced would substantially redesign the immigration enforcement system, how the government responds to the symptoms of that sort of flawed visa structure. Obama is proposing basically to continue to strengthen immigration enforcement at the border, at the southwest border, but essentially to declare a moratorium on most interior immigration enforcement. This would go a long way toward reversing the ratcheting up of immigration enforcement that we've seen over the last decade. And while executive action stops well short of a permanent legalization bill that would provide a path to citizenship, it's hard to overstate the potential importance of these changes in the day-to-day lives of most unauthorized immigrants. The other interesting question is what executive action means for where we're going in the future, including whether Congress can pass a CIR bill. The answer is, I think, that executive action likely makes CIR more difficult in the current session of Congress because it deepens the divide between congressional Republicans and the president. This is the argument that we've heard many congressional Republicans making. The most immediate legislative result of the executive action is that we'll spend the next month and maybe a lot of this session of Congress debating and fighting over congressional efforts to block it and possibly shut down DHS or whether or not whether DHS is going to get shut down. But to say that this makes Congress less likely to pass CIR assumes that congressional Republicans would have considered CIR in the absence of Obama's actions. The historical record says they probably wouldn't have. And the 2014 elections make it less likely because Republicans won in heavily Latino states like Texas, despite taking hardline positions on immigration issues. Some people hold out hope for a piecemeal approaches to immigration reform in this Congress, and it's possible, but I'm skeptical about what these pieces would look like. But in the medium to long term, I'm so excited to have something sort of optimistic to give in a talk. I haven't done that in so long. there's a real possibility that executive action may be just what we need to break the congressional gridlock and to force hardliners to come to the bargaining table. And the reason I say that is because a moratorium on most interior enforcement would turn the existing legislative dynamics of immigration policy on their head. The huge procedural advantage that opponents of CIR have, as I've mentioned, is that the existing law already calls for tough enforcement. And as long as the status quo involves hundreds of thousands of deportations a year and leaves even long-settled unauthorized immigrants vulnerable to being deported, hardliners can block any bill they don't love because the status quo looks pretty good to them. Obama's executive action changes these bargaining dynamics by shifting what game theorists would call the reversion point. If existing immigrant communities are protected by executive action, then it's advocates for CIR who are generally satisfied with the status quo, and they can walk away. And hardliners have an incentive to seek a deal. So if executive action can be successfully implemented, then unauthorized immigrants win in the short run because they receive a significant degree of protection from deportation, and advocates for CIR should win in the long run because it disrupts the non-enforcement equilibrium that's been so difficult, that's really blocked legislative action for 30 years now. So if I have about 2 more minutes or 1 more minute, what's the impact of these reforms on sort of broader US politics? I want to give 2 quick answers to that question. One answer, and again, Sylvia is more of an expert on this than I am. One answer is that I think that executive action likely helps Democrats in 2016 by restoring waning enthusiasm among Hispanic voters. This will be especially true if Republicans spend a big chunk of this session pulling out all the stops to block it. But it's probably also true even if it leads to negotiating on piecemeal pieces of immigration reform, because that's also a victory for Democrats. So either way, Democrats, I think, come out looking good from this. A bigger picture answer, though, is that I also see executive action as a dangerous escalation of the imperial presidency and of congressional dysfunction. Immigrant advocates have made the case that Obama's action is similar to ones taken by other Democratic and Republican presidents, Reagan and Bush, you hear a lot. And while that's true in terms of its legal authority, Obama's changes are much larger in scope, and they come after a decade of congressional decisions not to pass similar laws and over explicit congressional objections, whereas previous executive actions were generally consistent with congressional preferences. So while I support the president's actions as good for immigration policy, they make me very nervous about the future of American political institutions. So having said that, let me also say that they are an escalation of an already existing trend. So what if Obama hadn't taken bold executive action? Does this mean that a future President Cruz or President Paul across from Congress who refuses to rewrite the tax code the way they want it wouldn't say, well, since Congress can't fix this, I'm going to do it on my own by not collecting, the death tax or not enforcing, the Clean Air Act. I think that one can make a good case that Obama's action was both radical and unprecedented and also totally predictable given where American politics is today.
Good morning. Thank you to Dina and the folks at the AJC and the good people of Rice University and the Baker Institute for having me here today. I'm just delighted to be here. Many, many moons ago, I actually worked in the Office of Admission before I went to graduate school. And that was in the old-timey days where we actually read paper applications that people wrote in pen. I know how old I must be. So I'm glad to be back on campus. So the theme of this conference about perspectives on immigration really gives a great opening for consideration of where Latino Americans, right, people who live in the United States, who are of Hispanic origin, and their views on this issue. It is critical to consider what Latino Americans think and experience on this issue for a couple of reasons. One, they most directly can benefit from policy, and they also bear the brunt of inaction or punitive policy and sometimes rhetoric. So I want to spend some time looking at the opinions of Hispanic voters while we have a trove of data of public opinion where Latinos who are voters, non-voters, citizens, non-citizens stand on a variety of issues. The data I'm going to present today are exclusively of Hispanic American citizens and of that subset, those who are active in the electorate. So first of all, immigration is important to Hispanic voters. When we asked people in this past election, and we talked to a little over 4,000 Hispanic voters the day before election, what are the most important issues facing the Latino community that politicians should address? The issue that was mentioned most often, and these don't add to, or these add to more than 100, and you know that because we're at Rice, is because we allow people to give more than one answer, right? Because people can simultaneously care about lots of things, right? But the issue that came up most often was immigration. And I should say that immigration has not been the priority issue for Hispanic voters for a long time. We started to see it pop up as the second most important and then the most important issue right around 2010, around Arizona SB 1070, and then as the political rhetoric started to escalate, well, Hispanic voters responded, and so since it seemed to be a priority for other folks, it became more resonant. But to be sure, this is an issue that resonates with Hispanic voters. It's not just that it's an issue that is important in terms of sentiment, it's also a mobilizing issue. When we asked how important is the issue of immigration in your decision to vote and for whom to vote, 67% said it was either one of the most important issues or the most important issue. For Hispanic voters, Hispanic voter party attachments are not that deep. They're not that entrenched. When we asked people, which statement would you agree with most? Would you say that you're voting in this election cycle to support the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or the Latino community? The Latino community won. 37% said that they were voting to support the Latino community, 34% for Democrats, and 16% for Republicans. And I should tell you that that share has increased. We've been asking that question since about 2010. So this is the third time that we've asked that question right before Election Day. And the share of voters who are saying that their vote is motivated less by party and more by community has increased. And why does immigration matter? Why do people who are citizens by definition, if they're voting, why does immigration matter so much? When we ask Hispanic voters, do you happen to know somebody who is an undocumented immigrant? 58% say yes. We've been asking this question since about 2008. And that number has been stable. We've seen it move from about 52% to 64%, but it generally hits around that number. And so the fact that over half of Hispanics who are casting ballots know somebody, we ask a further question. I don't have a slide for it, but we say, are these people your family, your friends, both? Over 90%, the people they know are people close to them, right? It's their parent, it's their grandparent, it's the person who their kids go to school with. These are deep connections. It's not just, oh, the guy who cuts my grass, I happen to know somebody. No. Those ties are much deeper. The Latino electorate doesn't see immigration as an abstract policy issue the way people who are often passing policy see it. It is about their families, and it's hard to get more personal than that. And this is the case across the Latino electorate. It's not just the Mexicans. I get asked that question. Well, isn't it just Mexicans who know the undocumented immigrants? Or isn't it just the people who are poorer? No, 63% of Hispanics who are second generation know an undocumented immigrant. Half, 52%, who are third generation, 55% who self-identify as Republican, 62% of the higher income, over half of those who are English dominant. Among younger voters, the 18 to 34, and then 35 to 49, as I get older, the younger bracket starts to hit that one. The younger voters who are 49, also larger shares of them, right, quite high, know people who are undocumented, and of course, 2/3 of Mexican Americans and Central Americans. And so when there's policy rhetoric, but also policy itself that does something about or to undocumented immigrants, it is very likely that the people who are going to vote, who hear that rhetoric, know somebody who will directly be affected. It's true that Hispanic voters have relatively weak party ties, certainly compared to other minority electorates. And it's true that Hispanic voters have a variety of positions that we would identify as conservative, and certainly some that are liberal. But when it comes to immigration issues, there's a real coalescence around all kinds of issues that touch on immigration. When it comes to issues that trigger ethnic identity, that's where we see Cuban Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Central Americans. Ethnic or national origin tends to not matter. Linguistic differences tend to not matter. When it triggers ethnic identity, there's a real cohesiveness of opinion. 74% of Latino voters opposed Arizona SB 1070. 85% supported the DREAM Act. 75% opposed repealing DACA. Actually, Congress did vote on an immigration issue. It wasn't comprehensive immigration reform. They did vote twice to repeal the deferred action policy that President Obama had put into place. 75% of Hispanic voters opposed that. And most recently, 89%, it's hard to get more overwhelming than that, are in support of the executive action that was just discussed. Again, that support is overwhelming. So when we asked if people supported or opposed the president using executive action to provide temporary relief from deportation and work permits to undocumented immigrant parents of legal residents, 68% said they strongly support it, 21% said somewhat, 88% among non-Mexican Latinos, 85% among Latinos who are probably not as close to the immigrant experience, who are English dominant, and 76% among Republicans. And to the earlier discussion about comprehensive reform, Latinos were much more favorable toward a legislative solution rather than executive action. We polled on that for about 2.5 years, and over 70% of Hispanic voters favored a comprehensive reform that included requirements for undocumented immigrants to learn English, that would require a waiting period of 5 years or more, that would require paying fines, passing a criminal background check, and securing the border, and providing employer sanctions. For Latino voters, as is the case for most Americans, comprehensive immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship is not mutually exclusive from providing national security and border protections. Again, the support for executive action is just consistent across groups. I mean, when you're hitting an average of 89%, you know, that number isn't going to fall too low among any cross-section of the Hispanic electorate. So among those that you would be most likely to think would be in opposition to it, 76% of Hispanic Republicans, self-identified Republicans, said they supported the executive action decision. And to the actions that are on deck for this week, 80% tell us that they are opposed to congressional efforts to block the executive action. So we knew, right, as soon as the press releases were ready to go, as soon as the decision was made public, we knew that Republicans would say that they would look to ways to cut the program. So when we asked people about Republicans saying that they would cut funding for executive action so that the government couldn't issue temporary work visas, 80% of Hispanic voters say that they didn't want Congress to do that. And it's clear that Hispanic voters see the political landscape as it is when they're asked, who do you think is most to blame for the lack of progress on immigration reform? 64% blamed Republicans in Congress, and 24% Obama and Democrats. We know that the Senate passed a bill, but the House opted not to take it up. Looking forward to President Cruz or President Paul. So what are the political implications of this? Right, 2014 is over, and so now everyone's chomping at the bit about 2016. So looking at where Hispanic voters, this is just favorability, not who are you going to vote for, what party do you support most, but just favorability. Do you have a positive or negative view of this person, or have you even heard of them? The most favorable person, and this was asked again on the eve of election, was Hillary Clinton at 69%. All of the Republicans that we asked about, Jeb Bush, Rubio, Cruz, and Paul, none of them got more than 31% of a favorability rating, in large part because Hispanics don't know a lot of who these folks are, right? 41% have no opinion or never heard of Senator Paul, and a similar share have never heard of Ted Cruz. Interestingly, I think it's worth noting that in Florida, just the Hispanic electorate in Florida, Jeb Bush is actually about 3 points more popular than Marco Rubio. So to the extent that is the state that is going to capture everybody's heart in that contest. The issue of immigration and how politicians address it is more important than party, and even in some cases, what the parties have done in the past. Rubio was one of the Gang of Eight senators who helped advance the comprehensive bill in the Senate, but then sort of backtracked on that. Jeb Bush has a pretty well-established history of having favorable views on immigration reform, and so it'll be interesting to see where that contest turns in Florida in particular. Lots of folks have told us, well, since Hispanics in the last 2 elections have voted overwhelmingly for Democrats, then the Republicans' chances of getting back into the good graces of the Latino electorate are over. But the partisan opportunities here are real, because one of the best predictors of what people will do in the future is what they've done in the past. And so when we ask Hispanic voters, have you ever voted for a Democrat? 89% say yes. Have you ever voted for a Republican? 52% say yes. And that's not just in Florida, right? This past election down in Cameron County in Brownsville, Texas, right? The voters there re-elected a Republican to be the county judge, who actually just got appointed to a statewide office by Republican Governor Greg Abbott. So to the earlier point about Latino voters not turning out to vote, some of that has to do with the fact that this particular contest was an off-year election, but it also has to do with where races are competitive. And it happens to be the case that over half of the Latino electorate, over half, live in non-competitive states: Texas, California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois. Those are not competitive states. And so Latino turnout is quite low. In states that are competitive, where parties do invest, Nevada, Colorado, in 2012 in New Mexico, Hispanic turnout is much higher relative to other states. So to that I say, don't blame the victim here. It's not just us, right? In Texas and California, turnout is low across the board. So with that, I'll stop there, and I think we'll turn to questions.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. I have a couple of comments, and maybe I'll ask some questions. We'll have a dialogue and take your questions. On Mark's, he made a couple of observations. I'd like to go back to the impact of 9/11. I was working for President Bush at that moment, and I think you cannot underestimate that, because it seems to me that was a perfect storm. As you may recall, President Vicente Fox had been at the White House, and there was just a lot of enthusiasm. President Bush was at the top of his game. He'd just been elected. He had broad Democratic support. And I think the feeling was that we were going to pass a broad-based comprehensive immigration reform bill. But on the morning of 9/11, with all of that tragedy, I think everyone that was involved in immigration policy knew that it was DOA. In fact, no one wanted anything even remotely touching immigration to come up before Congress. I remember Senator Dianne Feinstein, right after 9/11, was proposing that we eliminate foreign student visas to the United States. It was that bad. So that clearly was a change. And as Mark alluded, I think that gave obstructionists, the anti-immigrant groups, they were able now to bring in national security and wrap themselves in that flag. And the other big thing that I think drives this debate, and you cannot, I'd like to get the panelists their comments, I think, is the media. With all the media outlets down, and people can pick so many on talk radio and Fox News, from Lou Dobbs to others, media commentators have made immigration sort of a red meat issue that they pound. And I know a few, in fact, where's Beto in there? Anyway, you take Lou Dobbs. He was the most anti-immigrant person as long as he had his show. And at one point, we were contemplating, Beto, bringing him down here because he was supporting immigration reform, which was diametrically opposite of what he was preaching. He was doing more damage to the cause than anyone. We have a local commentator on 740 News that I know that has, who has moved to River Oaks and is living on Del Monte. And I talked to him one day because we had been on a NPR show, and I was struck how reasonable and common sense he was on immigration, because I'd come there prepared to sort of go after him, but he was sort of broadly, we didn't disagree. And I said, why don't we talk about that on your show? I won't give you his name, but some of you may. And he laughed at me and said, are you kidding? He said, are you kidding me? He said, my listeners don't want to hear any reasonable, rational discussion. They want red meat. They want me to be angry. So when you think about that, a lot of these Republican congressmen, they're scared to death because of their base. And their base is scared to death because the media drives them on this issue with many distortions about this issue. So anyway, I'll let, and one more comment about the, Sylvia gave us some most informative statistics, but a Rice professor, we all know, got a middle blank, Steve Kleinberg always likes to point out that Texas already is a majority Hispanic state under the age of 18. And so it's just a matter of time before that's going to have a big impact on Texas politics. So I'll defer to the two of you now.
Well, I'll just, I mean, I couldn't agree more about 9/11 and the timing. And just to put a finer point on your comment, Vicente Fox was here. There was a first ever joint cabinet meeting of the full Mexico and U.S. cabinets on September 8th, 2001. And they signed a framework agreement to negotiate a comprehensive bilateral treaty that would have involved a guest worker program and a legalization, and Mexico playing a larger role on border enforcement, 3 days before the 9/11 attacks. So, we don't know how that would have played out, but it's certainly possible that it would have played out differently without those attacks. And on your media point, I would agree and just say, a lot of what makes it hard to pass an immigration bill applies to, it's hard for Congress to do anything right now. I mean, we live at a time where, the polarization and including as a result of the sort of micro-targeted media and people, listening to their their echo chambers. There's a very short list of congressional accomplishments and in the post 9/11 period, and most of them are responding to 9/11.
So Texas is actually already a majority-minority state. We're just not Latino majority, but that day will come. On behalf of me and my 7 brothers and sisters, I promise. Yay, Mom, we're number 1. That actually, again, folks here at Rice who've done some of those projections, it looks like about 2040, 2042, that Texas will be a Latino majority state. But right now we are already a majority minority state. And as you know, pockets of this state have been Latino majority since long before Texas was a state, right? You only get that way because you have the Valley, El Paso, and Laredo, right? And on that point, that's where, I think media influence is important, and why Texas had been such an outlier on so much of the harsh rhetoric and policy, because Texans and Texas elected officials knew Latinos. Nobody had to sort of explain to George Bush, this is a Mexican American, and he didn't play the mariachi politics because he knew better than that. He knew us, he knew who we were, and whatever your politics were, I don't think people had a sense that if somebody wasn't going to vote for George W. Bush, it wasn't because they thought he didn't like Mexicans, right? You had the luxury of making a decision based on your policy preferences, as opposed to they might do something mean to me or people like me. And that is what is so peculiar about watching the tenor of politics change in this state, when you have folks, right, the same folks who voted for in-state tuition are suddenly saying this is, such a terrible idea. And I'm thinking, you like us, because I know you do. You're just saying that because you had voted for that bill just a few sessions ago. And so familiarity and direct interaction with people who are Latino, who are immigrants, tends to diffuse that kind of not just rhetoric, but also genuine sentiment. So it's been a really sort of peculiar thing to watch candidates sort of campaign against Texas in a way, right? To watch these commercials where they go to Laredo or the Valley or El Paso, and they're sitting on a truck with a gun saying, "I'm gonna protect you." I'm like, but that's part of Texas. Perhaps if folks got to know more of their own state, that would be beneficial.
I'd like to pick up on this theme of George W. Bush having worked for him. I've often said in these forums, when he ran for president, he had two major his major domestic policy issue was going to be immigration reform, and believe it or not, his major international issue was going to be immigration reform, because he was sort of, he knew he was not his father. Jeb Bush was more like his dad, so Bush was so proud of the fact that he had hosted all of the border state governors. He was proud of the fact that he spoke Spanish. I put that in quotes, and that was going to be his big international initiative. And again, that changed on the morning of 9/11. I remember working for him. I first wrote a bunch of policy stuff that was sort of small bore, and he said, "Oh no, I want a big grand bargain with Mexico." And the other thing, the sort of guiding principle he said was that, as simple as it was, very few politicians got this. He said, "Why should we have our border patrol gang tackling someone's favorite nanny or strawberry picker or construction worker? Why don't we route those people? Those people should be routed into a legal program." And the third principle he said was that he was against amnesty. And so amnesty, of course, as my panelists and many of you know, you could say the legalization program of '86 was because folks who qualified that had been here prior to January 1, 1982 could apply directly for conditional lawful permanent residency. So out of all those discussions came this idea of sort of earned legalization. You had to be here for so many years, pass tests, no cutting in line, and that's where you had all these discussions where there was a 10-year or 12-year period because the line was a quota backlog. A little footnote to history and the campaign structure. In that first campaign, there was Karl Rove, who was also I've heard him give some of the best speeches ever that could have been given by any liberal Democrat on immigration policy. And then Tim Adams. And under Tim Adams, there was a series of very bright folks and lawyers, one of which was sort of more or less assigned to work with me. and we worked together for 9 months on immigration policy. He was a bright lawyer from Harvard. I don't know whatever came of him. His name was Ted Cruz. But we worked on redefining what was called amnesty at that point. But he has forgotten that, I think. Any other comments? You want to take some questions? Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you both for your excellent presentations. Will there be copies available of your presentations? I'd love to read what.
They'll be posted online.
Okay, great.
In video.
Number two, being that comprehensive immigration reform is dependent upon congressional support, what would you say in response to the New York Times printed an article in October 2014 saying why House Republicans alienate Hispanics, they don't need them. And it basically said that the Latino vote was not critical for them. And so if that is the case, and we want comprehensive immigration reform, what would be your response to?
Well, we've gotten into a few Twitter spats with Nate Cohn, so couple things. It is true that most Republicans do not represent Latino influenced districts. But as somebody else pointed out earlier, it's not just Latino voters who care about immigration. It's what I talked about today. But there are there are lots of great white people, there are lots of great black people, there are lots of Asian people. There are lots of people who care about immigration reform for reasons that have little to do with sentimentality and ethnic politics. It has to do with building their businesses or sustaining their communities in terms of employment and that sort of thing. All the things that people have talked about today. So it's not just that electorate that cares about that issue. I also think that one can overplay their hand, right? One can overestimate the extent to which they win votes by being antagonistic, and we've seen that happen in Nevada when there was a really hardline anti-immigrant candidate for the Senate a few years ago named Sharon Engel, and she lost to Harry Reid, and she didn't lose only because of Latino voters. They were important, but they weren't the only ones. The other thing I would say is that, in off-year elections, the Latino electorate does take on less importance because of the way gerrymandering has rendered districts. But there are presidential elections every 4 years too. And then there's also just, the demography isn't destiny, but demography and the number of Latinos who are eligible, the number who turn out, certainly change the calculus from cycle to cycle.
Can I just add something quickly? Well, two things. One is that Dina wants you to remember that there are Jews who care about immigration policy also.
Oh, well,
I would answer the question that, I think there's a difference between the party's short-term interests and the long-term interests. And the long-term, the Republican Party clearly has an interest, especially at the presidential level, in making nice with Latino voters. But for almost every Republican in the House of Representatives, their short-term re-election benefits from taking a hard line, particularly in primary races, but even in the general election in terms of getting out there base voters, their short-term interests benefit from an enforcement-only approach because that's who elects them. So that's like a fundamental challenge for how the party can continue to take that position, year after year, and then at some point pivot to a more expansive view on it, and I don't think that it's part of the whole struggle within the party between the Karl Rove and George Bush and John McCain Republicans and Ted Cruz and others.
And talking about statistics, interestingly, you mentioned Asian American voters voted even in a heavier percentage for President Obama than did Hispanics, and that's a big turnaround. Let's see, we've got a number. There's a lady right there.
Hi, my name is Eileen Josephs. I've been an immigration attorney for over 20 years, and I've been in the battlefield. Therefore, I'm an activist. I'm co-chair of Florida Voices for Immigration Reform, and I want to thank all of you. And Mr. Rosenblum, thank you too. And this question is more for history. I'm passionate about immigration policy. I studied under Professor Lawrence Phipps at Brandeis University, who you may know. So for history, I would like to know what drove the Obama administration in 2009 to forget the Latinos went out. I was one that told everyone in Palm Beach County to vote for him because we were promised immigration reform. And rather than have immigration reform, we had the enforcement mechanism and cemented into law in that Democratic Congress. So I want to understand the private correctional industry that we know benefits from the criminalization of the immigrant. What were the backroom deals that we would like to know? Because that was a missed opportunity, and one that if we would have acted on wouldn't have created the social chaos that we have now in these 3 Central American countries. I'm the honorary consul of Guatemala in Palm Beach County. So I have seen the devastation of these failed policies. So just for history, I would like to know that. Thank you.
So I would say the answer is, and I'll take it back historically, actually to 2006. When the 2006 CIR talks fell apart after the Senate passed the McCain-Kennedy bill, the Bush administration made a decision at that point to increase interior enforcement, targeting employers in order to raise the stakes and to try to put pressure on Republicans sitting on the fence to sort of force them to the bargaining table through tougher enforcement. And when you look, we actually, at Migration Policy Institute, we released a report in April of last year and a follow-up report in October that document this very clearly. And then when Obama was elected in 2008, and I was on his transition team and involved in some of these conversations in 2008 and 2009, there was, at that point, an explicit decision made, and this was related to the Bush decision, to do tough enforcement as a way to make a down payment. Bush was trying to sort of force Republicans to the table by imposing pain on their constituents. Obama was interested in, and Bush had also done this through tough enforcement at the border, in proving that we've done enforcement first as a way to make a down payment on CIR. And it was a strategic calculation that by checking the enforcement box in a credible way, that would address the concerns of people who didn't believe that CIR cared about enforcement, and then create the conditions to then move on to legalization and visa reform. And I think that was a strategic call that because of the way the relationship between Obama and Congress evolved, and the economic downturn, and the sort of spending 4 years redebating healthcare, we never made that pivot. But I think that's the answer to your question.
Yeah. And I'd like to emphasize, because I hear this criticism of President Obama, and I don't think it's very fair. I remember when, right after he was elected, he went down to Mexico, met with President Calderon. He was in Guadalajara, and I'd actually sent some wording for some of the stuff he said. And he came out and he said that he was was going to immediately support broad-based comprehensive immigration reform right after health care, cap and trade, and the reform of the financial system. So my heart sank, because I'd seen that before, because in 2000, after the re-election of President Bush, he had told me he was going to push that right after he got re-elected, but he started with privatization of Social Security accounts. So I think the biggest, President Obama had a majority in both the House and the Senate, and he made a hard choice. He picked financial reform right after the collapses of the market and health care first, and if he had picked immigration reform first, I think we would have had a big immigration bill. But unfortunately, by the time he got to it, the Republicans had taken the House. Let's see. Yes, sir.
So recognizing this will sound like a naive question, but living in Houston, where I will characterize the Houston Republican business community is pretty pro-immigration reform. Who is it, other than red meat Tea Party folks, that funds the Republican Party positions that are against immigration reform?
Maybe I can take that because I know a lot of those funders. I think what it is, you're absolutely right. The funders, the people who give the money, the Ned Holmes of the world, the John Nowls, they're actually with us on immigration reform. I think the problem is there, and we've had some of those meetings, I know Beto's been in them, where we've said, draw the line. Tell them you won't support you unless you take unless you're more pro-immigration reform. I think the problem is they're with us, but it's not their number one issue. So they still continue to funding. They may say something, but it's not. But they won't. They don't stop funding these guys, even though they disagree with them on immigration, because they agree with them on other issues.
I think, it goes back to the comment I made earlier. I think immigration is a priority for a lot of business groups, the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of small employers. It's not their top priority. They're more concerned about Obamacare and they're more concerned about regulation. They're all still able eventually to hire somebody.
I was just going to make a comment. I know we've been talking politics, and as difficult as it is, but I think the Latino community and just communities in general need to become much more aware of their power as consumers. And you can imagine the impact of these 11 million plus refusing to buy certain products from certain individuals that are given to these candidates. But it's something that's very difficult to do, but I wouldn't take it off the table. I think we should work and inform, we should all be informed about what's happening and what's the consequences of us buying products from individuals that are supporting policies that are opposed to our interests. But I want you to, Mayor, respond to it, not so much how difficult it is, but is there any possibility of that happening? We saw some of that more symbolically, I think, when people boycotted on May 1st, but I just think it's something that has to be done, even if on a limited basis. Because it's not a lot of changes haven't come about just because of the legislative process, but also because of the power of movements at the grassroots level.
I'll just say one thing about that, which is, just to the last part of your comment, I think there's no question that what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years is the power of movements and the dreamers, in the streets forcing, the reason we have executive action, to a large degree is that the dreamers, not through voter mobilization, but through civil disobedience, really force that issue onto the table.
Yes, sir.
2 questions. Number one, with your polling data, you showed a large number concerned with immigration, but it's kind of short. Were they for it or against it? The other question is, are we looking at calling this the wrong thing, immigration versus economic migration? They're 2 different, really, subjects. So what are we talking about? Can we have a little better definition from y'all? What are we actually talking about?
So when we ask about immigration, a whole bunch of things, you're right, fall into that because it's an open-ended question. So if someone says deportation, someone says DREAM Act, someone says border control, we're going to lump that all into that immigration bar. And that's why we do those deeper dive questions like, so you said immigration is important, well, then what's your view on comprehensive reform? What's your view on enforcement only, or most recently on executive action? But for the most part, Latinos are in favor of a comprehensive reform. When we asked about piecemeal legislation, there was support for that too. What Latinos generally oppose is an enforcement-only approach.
On that subject that you brought up about 9/11 and turning immigration into a security issue, I was just thinking about events of the past week. Might that be happening again? Because the Paris events seem to have engendered something of a sea change in attitude toward the prospects of terrorism. And I wonder whether that can spill over into the immigration issue.
It's certainly, well, first of all, I think that's very likely to be the case in parts of Europe, in France and elsewhere in Europe. And I think, we're already hearing that some in the EU are revisiting earlier, conversations about data sharing with the U.S. to be more cooperative with U.S. anti-terror efforts than they had been before. In the U.S., I think maybe yes. Certainly we saw with the children arriving, even though that very much was not a security threat and it was not even a border crisis because the children were arriving and, running to the first green shirt they saw to present themselves and seek relief. But it's still, we have such a long conversation now about border security and securing the border, and we're so conditioned to understand the immigration debate in terms of illegal migration across the southwest border that we tend to take any blip in immigration flows or these things and to shoehorn them now into that frame. So I certainly the events in France don't make a CIR bill easier. I'm not sure how much harder they make it. I would say.
I would think it would make it difficult for Congress to make a play to cut funding for DHS.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's true. So and they'll, if the next round of the executive action debate plays out as, attached to a DHS appropriations bill, that's sort of a chicken game where, maybe the House Republicans attach language Obama can't agree to DHS funding, and then are Senate Democrats willing to filibuster that, and then they're sort of responsible for shutting down DHS, and it's, which side blinks first, or is Obama willing to veto it over that? It's I think it's hard to project who gets blamed for shutting down DHS in that situation, but maybe it causes the leadership to try to not find themselves there.
One more comment that I agree with everything said, and I think the incidents in Paris will be used by people to inflame people, scare people. We've seen our own governor sending the Department of Public Safety troops down to where Mark said that was really not even an immigration issue. It was these kids were entitled to due process hearings. But what strikes me is that no one ever points out that the real wide open border is our Canadian border. The only real known incidents of terrorists crossing into the U.S. Come across our Canadian border, but they get a free pass. I was particularly intrigued when Scott Brown was running in New Hampshire, and he kept on talking about the border and border security, and he actually had a border with Canada where people had crossed over to commit terrorists, but that's never looked at. Let's see. Yes, sir.
How many of the 11.4 million are Hispanics, but are people that overstay their visas? Because that is all. Isn't that a factor in all this and never gets talked about?
About a little over half, 55% or so of the unauthorized immigrants are from Mexico. Another 20% or so are from elsewhere in Latin America. So about 80% altogether, 75, 80% are Hispanic or Latin American. Then there's another question about entry without inspection versus visa overstays, and we don't have hard data on that. That's a harder question to estimate, but between a third and half probably are visa overstays versus 2/3 to half are people who cross the border.
So that's a totally different
set of enforcement issues, and yes, we really, as a policy matter, only care about people who cross the border without inspection. I mean, the one thing I'll say, that's partly because those people are browner and lower income and speak less English and things like that. It's also because anybody who overstays a visa has been screened and determined admissible. So we know something about visa overstays that makes them less of a national security threat than border crossers. But that's not the main reason that we care more about border crossers. I agree with you.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. Richard Fulton from the American Jewish Committee's Washington office. Assuming that we were lucky enough to get to a point where, in fact, there was a willingness to see if we could negotiate out some kind of bill over this next Congress, it strikes me that one of the dividing points that remains is very much the issue of legalization versus citizenship, path of citizenship. In terms of willingness on both sides to come forward on that, is this an issue where on the pro-immigration reform side, you see any willingness to give on that issue, or would that remain an issue that could cause the whole thing to collapse anyway?
Speaking, since I was here, right here in this room, not that long ago, was Congressman Luis Gutierrez. And he, to me, is sort of the leading proponent of immigration reform, and I was very encouraged. He clearly indicated that he would have made a big compromise to do the greater good, to stop the bleeding. So there are, I do hear, and it bothers me, I do hear Democrats say, oh no, we'll make a zero compromise on that. And there must be a pathway to citizenship. But maybe my colleagues here would disagree with me. I think that's really sort of a red herring to begin with. The vast majority of the people we're trying to help, they're not interested in citizenship per se. They're interested in just peace of mind, getting an interim, any kind of a status that gives them the right to work and travel and not be scared. And there was a good political, I think that's where the political compromise is, so that the Republicans are hung up on this pathway to citizenship. In fact, I had asked at one point, I was counseling the White House not to use that because it was totally wrong to begin with. It's a pathway to lawful permanent residency. And if you look at the statistics from the '86 Act, after almost 30 years, somewhere only 30 or 40% of the individuals who could have qualified for citizenship have ever gotten around to applying for citizenship. It's sort of optional. But the real test was, at the end of this period, do you automatically have the right to apply for permanent residency? And that was contained in the Senate bill. And I think the House bill, I think there was a compromise to be had that says, no, you don't have the automatic right to qualify for residency, but you could qualify through independent means, like through your adult citizen children or through your employers. And I always thought that was a good compromise.
I mean, I'll just briefly add that I think that in 2007, when the Senate tried again to pass a CIR bill, there was in 2006 that was called the blue card proposal. That was Senator Specter had proposed a blue card, which would have been permanent temporary status. And when things fell apart in 2007, there was a proposal floated to do to have something, without a guaranteed path to citizenship, but a durable legalization. And at the time, Democrats, the interest groups, the immigrant rights groups, and Democrats were steadfastly 100% opposed, and that's why that was sort of the final end to those negotiations. And I agree that if that offer were on the table now, certainly Luis Gutierrez would take it, and I think most Democrats would take it. I mean, and I also think that it is sort of a compromise. I think it also drives a wedge between sort of most unauthorized immigrants and most of their advocates, because most unauthorized immigrants would take it in a heartbeat, but their advocates have been very opposed to it, and the Democratic Party has been very opposed to it because they'd rather have 11 million voters than 11 million legal temporary residents.
Yeah. Tony.
Charles, well, it's kind of nice to talk about the past, but let me ask you, what do you see in the future? What's the most likely outcome given the circumstances?
Well, I'm an optimist, but I've been proven wrong so many times. But actually, Mark touched on this. If you look at past executive actions, they've almost always been ratified in some fashion or the other by Congress sooner or later. So I agree that while temporarily it's poisoned the well, I think the overriding sort of interest of the adults in the Republican Party was that they're going to try to do something on this issue before 2016, and they're going to get over. They're going to let their members of their caucus have these votes, which I think in the end will be meaningless on trying to stop the executive action. But I think they're going to realize once it's implemented, no one's ever going to take it away. Just like we talked yesterday, but we have TPS going on forever. No one's ever going to be able to end that. So even a future President Cruz, I think he would be under pressure to continue he wouldn't do it again, but the status. So I think it makes it easier down the road. So I'm optimistic that they're going to do something positive on immigration before the 2016 election. But I know the other arguments, but Mark, you can give those.
I'm optimistic that they'll do something positive on immigration after the 2016 election as a result of it. I think that the primary dynamics for the Republican presidential race have started, and they're a further reason that it's hard for them to do something good, or to ratify it, especially because so many sitting senators will be involved in that. But if executive action, holds up to these initial challenges and people sign up, And then if Democrats win in 2016 and are able to protect that, then I totally agree that it becomes harder and harder for Congress to remain in opposition to it rather than to co-opt it or to ratify it afterwards.
One more, I'm a political junkie, and I was the only one that watched every single debate, Republican and Democrat alike, in the last election. I'm sort of actually distressed that they're cutting those debates, actually. But I think the interesting point of the debates on the Republican side where the issue will be debated is Jeb Bush. Jeb has said, he was in a quandary whether he was going to run or not, and he's made this decision. He is going to run, but he's decided he's not going to do like Romney and try to reinvent himself. So he's going to be a candidate who will defend those positions in the Republican primary instead of running. In the past, they've run away from those issues, and I think he might get credit for just even if people disagree with him, just because he's a man of principle. He's not just shifting in the wind. But at least it's going to cause this to be, I think, a central debate in the Republican primary process. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I had read what you had said, Charles, about them not ever taking it back once something like this was in place, because that's really important for anybody who is actually going to sign up. I mean, I would think that people would hesitate to sign up because they would put themselves out there. There they would be to be deported in the next round if it didn't stay permanent. Well, the executive action. So are you suggesting to people they sign up?
I'll be a big advocate. I'll be out on the trail of pushing that. I think this is manna from heaven, the best thing that's happened since sliced bread. They're going to get a 3-year work authorization. They're going to get a Social Security card. They're going to get a driver's license. And if history tells us anything, it will be renewed and renewed. It'd be hard for me to imagine that once those people are fully integrated into society, working openly, maybe working in the congressional office right next to them, that they're going to decide to put them back into, create more illegal immigration. Like that's my platform. The other thing is, in the past, and I'm not certain, from a policy point of view, there have been announcements from the enforcement agency that they will not mine that data. They will not use that data for enforcement purposes. So I think the service will engage in. They won't have the budget for it for an educational campaign, pointing out that they're not going to use this information in an adverse fashion. Others, anyone?
Could I make a comment on this very issue that we're talking about? I don't think history tells us that these programs have come to an end. If you look back, I mean, there hasn't happened.
Yeah, I know.
Now, what is sad, though, is that we have several 100,000 people now in the U.S. who have been here for more than 10 years, renewing work permits every 18 months, and there is no sign that they will ever come out of that particular limbo. I'm talking about the people who have benefited from temporary protected status, primarily people from El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And while I hear very much Mark's warnings about the chances for piecemeal to proceed, I would say that it's worth daring to try. Because if there is one group of people who have absolute merits, in terms of accessing legal permanent residency, and 5 years later, if they want citizenship, that would be the class of people that are known as TPS recipients. And I think that that's, again, worth trying, especially because where they are located throughout the US. And I, for one, do believe that that's possible. I remember back in 1996, we were being told by all our friends in DC, don't even try, don't even bother trying anything because the well is poison, so you're going to waste money and time trying to pass something good. Well, we passed in 1997, the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act, which resulted in several 100,000 people accessing legal permanent residency.
I'd like to add what you said, Oscar, and I don't think you implied. I think the TPS, they're in this status, is certainly a lot better than anything else. So even if the beneficiaries of executive actions didn't get anything but a renewable 3-year work visa status, it's a lot better than the alternative.
No, I'm talking about equity,
Yeah,
Charles.
yeah.
I mean, I think if somebody has been on a status like that for 10 or more years, we should be creative enough to come up with a solution that is more just to those people, but by no means saying that that's not working.
They would have been left out of both the CIR bills.
Yes.
I mean, they.
Yes.
My name is Jerry Gonzalez from Atlanta, Georgia. Recently, the movie Selma opened, and in the movie, it highlights our historical perspective of how that created a moral crisis for our country. We've not seen that yet with the immigration issue. Do you think we need that to get something done? And just get reaction from.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that we've seen some of that with the Dreamers, you know, engaging in civil disobedience and sort of putting their status on the line, and that's had a very powerful, you know, influence on the debate, and I think really pushed President Obama, you know, to take some of the steps that he's taken in the last few years. Having said that, you know, there are big differences between unauthorized immigrants and African Americans under Jim Crow, because there is this element of personal responsibility, and the Dreamers had special status of not having that personal responsibility, but you know, African Americans who were disenfranchised and otherwise, you know, discriminated against, had sort of a more powerful humanitarian argument to make. So it just makes it a little bit complicated, but I do think that you know, it has to be a movement that is, it's not going to just be driven by Congress, you know, doing this by itself.
Leadership.
Let's see.
Lack of leadership.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
there's certainly no MLK in the, you know,
And there will not be.
Yeah,
Can
there
I
won't
show
be
you that?
probably.
Okay, one more question, then we're over. Yes, ma'am. You got it.
Oh, thank you. I'm curious to know what state's power is. You mentioned that Perry had sent a National Guard to the border, and this morning I heard Dan Patrick on NPR say that the priorities of Texans are border security and lower taxes. And I'm concerned about what power he has, he and now the whole Republican legislature and governor of Texas have to make a difference in Texas that doesn't rely on national legislation. How much can Texas on its own do on the border?
Well, I would say, obviously, the governor has a great deal of authority in terms of police authority. I just think it's a misuse. I think he can. There's nothing. I'm sure it's in his power to send down the Department of Public Safety. They have limited ability to enforce immigration law, but they could. I mean, if they're there to make sure that there's not a high level of crime rate being committed, that's within his authority. Interestingly, I think most of you know, the crime rate in the border counties are much lower, about the lowest in the state of Texas. So they should be sending these people to Amarillo or somewhere else. Now, I know Patrick, and he has two issues, what they could do for good or bad. One, repeal the DREAM Act, the so-called Texas DREAM Act, in-state tuition for residents. They could certainly do that. As we discussed, that was passed unanimously and signed by Rick Perry, so that's discouraging because there's been a real change in tone in the Republican legislature. But the pet bill for Patrick, now I hope he drops it, I think he may actually, is the so-called the end of sanctuary cities. And what that means is that they would act legislation that would either require or at least stop a police chief from instructing the local police and sheriffs from inquiring as to one's immigration status. In other words, they should be liberated to enforce federal immigration law. So I think he first of all, I think that would probably, after the Arizona versus Supreme Court, much of that would probably be held unconstitutional. And I think Dan Patrick may govern more responsible, sound a lot more responsible than he did when he was campaigning.
I was going to say the same thing. Keep your eye on the legislation as opposed to troops on the ground. That's where Patrick's real power is.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll just quickly add is it's those two dimensions: benefits, access to higher ed, and also access to healthcare that states have some control over. Some states have been expanding that. And then on the interaction with local, state and local law enforcement, with these new changes that the administration has announced to secure communities, those on paper at least would really limit the ability of local police to engage and sort of show me your papers law enforcement.
Great. Well, help us thank our panelists. Thank you, Charles. And please join us for lunch. It's served, or should be served by now. And our keynote speaker, Maria Hinojosa from Latino USA, who will speak over lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.